welcome back to another video as we unpack the entire Bible narrative. I'm Nate.
I'm Ashley.
And today we're going to be looking at Act 3, which is the story of God's people in the Old Testament. And it goes from Genesis 4 all the way until the book of Malachi before we enter the New Testament. But today, because it's a lot, we've broken it up into a few smaller pieces. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis 4 until the end of Deuteronomy. We're really excited for this.
So Nate, what happens in the first 5 books of the Bible?
Yeah, like a really small question. What happens in the first 5 books? Not much. There's a ton that happens. As the last 2 videos showed, sin has entered the world, and prior to that, God had created this beautiful world. And so Genesis picks up where God's people, Adam and Eve, are leaving the garden. The first 11 chapters of Genesis moves outward from the garden. We see sin causing so much chaos in these first few books, and there's now so much pain in the world, even to the point where God floods the entire world. Now there's so much that we could talk about in here, but God sees that what he has created has actually twisted. It's been contorted by sin. And so God ends up saving Noah and his family and all of creation, at least 2 animals, piles them into this ark, and then they end up being saved. Another big moment that happens in Genesis is that we're introduced to this guy named Abraham. We'll talk more about that later, but it's just good to know that this person is God's chosen person. This is who he's going to bless the whole world through. And so the rest of Genesis is basically the playing out of Abraham and his family as they figure out how do they do this well. And there's so much sin and challenges that come up with that. And then the book of Exodus, as we shift out of Genesis, the book of Exodus is, we basically are introduced to this guy named Moses. Now, the story shifts towards Israel as a whole as they spend time in Egypt. But again, the mandate hasn't changed. God wants to bless the entire world through Abraham's descendants, Israel. And so they go from being from just one person to being a nation, and they need to get out of Egypt. And so that's kind of the beginning of Exodus. That's kind of the move. And so the plan in Exodus is that God's going to get them out of Egypt, and their challenge is basically a showdown between God and Pharaoh as they try and move out of Egypt and out of this oppression. And so then it switches. They leave this and they're going to their promised land. But when they leave, they're still humans. They struggle with sin. They struggle with the challenges of being a people that are trying to live out this mandate that God has given them. And so the rest of the books, from middle of Exodus until Deuteronomy, is God telling these people how they are to live. The law is to set them apart. We have the introduction of the tabernacle where God's presence is going to be among them. And then we have the book of Deuteronomy where God's people have, an entire generation has died off and this whole new generation has come up and they need to be told of how to live again. So I know that's a lot, but essentially Genesis to Deuteronomy is this massive story of God's people moving outwards. But we're going to own in on a few of those details as this video goes on. So Ashley, we're introduced to this guy named Abraham about 12 chapters into the Bible. What's the deal with him? Why is he important, and what's God's plan through him?
Yeah, so Abraham is a very important character in the whole Bible story, and almost a main character role. Not quite as much as Jesus. But anyways, so one of the many cool things about Abraham is his name. And one thing I think is super cool about in the Bible is that names aren't just like, oh, you're gonna be named Ashley, and there's not, my name means ash tree. I'm not gonna fulfill a destiny.
That's kind of cool, though.
Kind of cool, but not as cool as what the names in the Bible are gonna be, because they're super intentional. And it's not just a label like Ashley, it's an identity. Yes, my name's Ashley, but I'm not an ash tree or anything. It's like a new destiny. It's pretty interesting, I think. And Abraham used to be called Abram, which can be translated to exalted father. And when God chose Abraham to lead a nation into what would be Israel, he changed his name to Abraham, which means father of many nations, which is exactly the destiny that Abraham fulfilled, which I think is so cool how God pays attention to those small details, including the names. So God chooses Abraham and calls him to leave his country and his entire life behind, like his family, his house, his land, all that kind of stuff, to go to the land that God will reveal to him. What a big and honorable task to be trusted with. So nowadays we have travel so accessible to us. We could hop on a plane, we could drive, we could take a bus, super easy. But imagine how much harder and how different it would be for back then when Abraham was just traveling on foot without any GPS or anything like that. Like crazy, like I know I could not do that. I can't even follow a paper map. So Abraham accepts this call and decides to obey God along with his wife, Sarah, his nephew Lot, and extended family. But why is all of this important? What is God's plan within it all? God promises six different things to Abraham with this call. To make Abraham into a great nation, to bless him, to make his name great, to make him a blessing, to bless those who bless him, and judge those who judge him, and ultimately bless all the people on earth through him. God has chosen Abraham to bring the nation of Israel into being, and through Israel, God will bring blessing to all people on earth. Now that's a heck ton of blessings.
That is a lot of blessing.
A lot. So with that, God's plan is to reverse the effects of judgment from Adam and Eve before on his creation through Abraham. And the book that Nate and I are reading together says this: though sin has brought God's curse on creation, God is still at work to recover his purpose of blessing for all that he has made, and Abraham is to be the medium divine restoration for the whole world. Through Abraham, all peoples on earth will be blessed. The promises of Abraham is to renew the vision of humanity that was first set out in Genesis 1 and 2, like we talked about before. God then makes a covenant with Abraham, which signifies the promises within their relationship. God continues to promise personal relationships, growth in their family into a nation and a land. Through this all, Abraham demonstrates a remarkable amount of faith and trust towards God, an example we should all live by. The story of Abraham is important in setting the scene for the rest of the Bible story. God desires a personal relationship with us, and like I mentioned before a couple times, he will continue to be faithful to us despite us not being faithful all the time. And I think that is so crazy on how faithful God is despite us not obeying him, despite us being led into sin, etc., etc. He is still always there, fulfilling his promises and being faithful and true to us.
So good.
So, as the story shifts throughout Genesis, God goes from working through a person to working through a nation. So, Nate, tell us exactly what is happening with Israel and the Exodus.
Yeah, so the book of Exodus is focused on this Exodus, and that basically means this mass departure of people who are leaving Egypt to head to their own land. So Exodus isn't detached from the book of Genesis. It's not as though we read Genesis, the story cuts off, and all of a sudden you're in Exodus. You see, Abraham's family in this story was now going to become a nation. And the book of Exodus is focused on Israel moving from Egypt towards the promised land. Because remember, at the end of Genesis, Abraham's family are all living in Egypt. That's where the food was when the plague came. If you remember the story of like Joseph and whatnot. And so they're living in Egypt now, but things aren't looking so hot. And so God is seeing that his people need to be like moved out because they're being treated poorly by this guy named Pharaoh. If you've probably heard the story like, let my people go. That's what we're talking about. So in this story, in the beginning of Exodus, we have the 10 plagues, and we have this showdown between God and Pharaoh, and these 10 plagues are to try and move Pharaoh's heart to let God's people, the Israelites, go towards the promised land. And the end of this results in Israel getting out of Egypt. And they run through the waters and they end up in the desert. Which is interesting because if you think about Jesus' life, and we're going to talk about this more in the New Testament, there's a lot of parallels between Israel and Jesus. You see, when they left Egypt, they had to go through the waters and they had kind of like a baptism and then come out the other side, and they spent time in the wilderness. And in Jesus' ministry, Jesus begins his ministry through baptism, through entering the water and then coming out the other side and spending time in the wilderness. But we'll find out in Exodus that God's people struggle in the wilderness. They aren't obedient and they struggle. Whereas Jesus, he thrives in the desert. He kills it. And so there's an important parallel there. So the book of Exodus is God working in these miraculous ways. Yet the Exodus focuses so much on this new nation, all of these new people, and how they are to live and be different than the world around them. Because at this point, God has attached himself at their hip. He isn't going anywhere. They're going to struggle with sin. They're going to go be separate from God. But God's saying, I am attaching myself basically to you, and I'm not going anywhere. And so that's the story of Exodus. After this story in Exodus, the storyline kind of slows down a little bit. Also, we get into these books of the Bible and we're like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it's not everyone's favorite reading. But we're going to look at try and break down a few parts. But first, let's talk about the law. What is the law and what was its purpose?
Yeah, so when you think of law, you might think of, my law 11-12 class when I'm going to the courts and stuff like that. But it certainly is not like that at all. But it sure would have been what the Israelites would have learned in their 11-12 law class, if they had one. But the law articulates the core principles that God intends and are to shape the lives of his people so that their lives will reflect his character. I think that it is so thoughtful and so intentional that God's motive for the law is for us to reflect his great character. We all want to become more like him, right? Well, I know that Nate and I do. The law includes instructions like not to worship any other gods, the Lord should be respected, and his name shall not be manipulated, a day of rest, and a few other things like not to murder people or steal. Seems easy enough, right? Like we said before, God is a personal God that desires a relationship with us. He desires us to reflect his character. And this interest of God in the details of his people's experience is shown clearly in the instructions God gives to regulate and shape every aspect of their lives under his rule. God loves and cares for us so much that he wants us to have a sin-free life full of love with him. It's almost like a loving parent telling us not to eat a heck ton of candy after we go trick-or-treating. It might sound like they don't care or they don't want us to have fun, but in reality, they're protecting us from getting a ton of cavities. God does the exact same thing. He doesn't necessarily tell us how much candy to eat or not and to avoid cavities, but these laws are in place to protect our hearts and to guide us to be better followers of him. With that, context is crucial. While the law is still relevant. That's what it is. Relevant to us. It was specifically written to the Israelites, and we may have to apply them in different ways for our own lives. With all of that, God's purpose of this law is to reflect his own character and intentions for his creation. With the law, the Israelites will now know how to display to the rest of the nations God's creation's purposes for humanity. So Nate, what about God's presence and the tabernacle?
Yeah, so I think one of the hardest parts of this, the first 5 books of the Bible, one of the hardest parts to get through are these like long drawn out chapters, which feels like over explaining the dimensions and the expectations that God had for Israel to build this thing called a tabernacle. And the tabernacle was where God's presence was among his people. It is confusing, but I think a part of that confusion is that we don't fully know the purpose of the tabernacle. We don't realize like just how important God's presence was to them and why it was so important for God to dwell among his people. So the purpose of the tabernacle was to have this portable space where God's presence would always dwell among his people. In Exodus, it says, "Then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." So God himself is going to live among his people. And it is worth pausing to look over the shape and nature of what they would be his official residence. Another reason for the seemingly long delay in the story where we stop and list off all of these details is that the worship of God is what Israel is all about. Exodus charts the course of this nation from slavery to worship. And servants of the great king will want to know every detail of his life in their midst. Once they were forced into building for the Pharaoh in Egypt, now they are willingly donating their materials and expertise to build God's house in their own presence. I think that's amazing. Even though like reading those chapters can be so tedious and boring, it's vital to think that this time prior to the Holy Spirit being poured out onto people, that the presence of God was to dwell among his people. God just wanted to be with them. And that's why this is so important. So what is the purpose then of the book of Deuteronomy? Like the law is being told again. That seems tedious. Like, why is that?
Yeah, so although God had clearly placed a ton of laws that were easily tangible for the Israelites to follow, they still disobeyed. And they chose a life of their own flesh and sin rather than a beautiful relationship with their Creator. They started to lack in their trust and faith towards what God had promised them to bring them to the promised land. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the faithless generation has died off. After the generation of Israelites who have lived in years of sin and thinking that their ways were better than Yahweh's.
Hey.
The next generation came up and Moses was ready to lead them on a path of obedience and relationship with God. With a new generation, Moses had to repeat the laws so that they had a foundation to be set on for life with God. The people's future and well-being in the land depends on them loving and serving God from their whole heart. When Moses revisits the law, he expands on it in relation to the Israelites' future in the land. He sets before them two options: blessing or judgment, and ultimately following the law will lead you to blessings from God. He then reminds them of the 10 commandments, which are the 10 bigger laws within the whole law. So if the Israelites respond to the law from God with faith and obedience, they will experience life and blessing. But if they respond to the law in unbelief and disobedience, they will face death and curse. Moses reiterates the law to encourage the nation to set their heart in a posture of obeying God and living a life with Him. So Nate, why is this important?
That's an important question to ask.
Yeah.
I think this is such an important and vital part of our Bible because, like, this is our story. Like, remember that God's call and like his desire for humans is to be a blessing to the whole world. And so we have to know these first 5 books of the Bible because we need to know, like, what was going on. Like, how did God first act through these people? So I think that's the first one. But the second one is that the struggles of living away from God come up over and over in these books. As you just shared in Deuteronomy, an entire generation had to die off because of how disobedient they were. And when I think of our own lives, like we live in such disobedience, like over and over and over again, and God keeps calling us back to Him. And so I think it's important to see the cycle of Israel struggling to live a life worthy for God. And I think that's why this is important. I think it's important to be immersed in this story because this is, in a way, our story. Alright guys, well thank you for joining us for this video. We've just started Act 3, Part 1, walking through the rest of the Old Testament. It's going to be good. And next, what are we going to talk about? We don't know.
Who knows?
But stay tuned, it's going to be good.
While the law is still relevant,
Relevant.
that's what it is. Relevant to us.